30 years ago, Nigeria were ranked as the 5th best national team in the world, above France, Italy and Argentina. The Super Eagles made their World Cup debut in 1994, 2 months after lifting their second African Cup of Nations, and they took the United States by storm. Nigeria topped a group containing Bulgaria, Argentina and Greece, and they led against eventual finalist Italy until the 88th minute in the round of 16, before falling to a brace by Ballon d'Or winner Roberto Baggio in extra time. Nigeria was sent home, but their style, flair and speed in transition left a lasting impact upon the world of football, with star men like JJ Okocha, Finidi George and Daniel Amokachi all catching the eye. 2 years later, Nigeria defeated a Brazil team containing Roberto Carlos, Rivaldo and Ronaldo in the semi-final, and an Argentina team featuring Roberto Ayala, Javier Zanetti and Hernan Crespo in the final, to win gold at the Olympics in the United States. By the time the 1998 World Cup came around, the Super Eagles had been further strengthened by the likes of Taribo West, Victor Ikpeba and Nwankwo Kanu. The largest country in Africa by population, and the second largest in the world in which football is the most popular sport, many predicted that Nigeria would be the national team to finally fulfill Pele's prophecy of an African nation lifting the FIFA World Cup. 27 years on though, despite a record 9 slots for African nations at the expanded 2026 World Cup, almost double the finals in Qatar, Nigeria have failed to qualify for a second successive World Cup, confirming that they will go at least 12 years, and the whole of the 2020s, without making a single World Cup appearance. Despite a dizzying array of attacking talent, including Fulham's Alex Iwobi, Europa League final hat-trick hero and Ballon d'Or nominee Ademola Lookman, and probably the third best out-and-out centre-forward on the planet right now in Victor Osimhen, who currently leads the Champions League scoring charts for Galatasaray, ahead of Erling Haaland, Nigeria finished below rival South Africa and level on points with their much smaller neighbours Benin during the group stage, before suffering defeat on penalties against DR Congo in the playoffs on Sunday evening. Nigeria's head coach Eric Chell accused the DR Congo staff of practicing voodoo during the shootouts. To make matters worse, it was a Hull City player who saved final penalty saw DR Congo progress, and which condemned Nigeria. Nigeria are now ranked 41st in the world, 10 places below Panama, and even that probably flatters them. For a country that views itself as a continental behemoth, once described as Africa's Brazil, it is a national humiliation, and one which prompted Nigeria's Under Fire Football Federation to publicly apologise to Nigeria's president and the country's more than 200 million inhabitants for what they described as, quote, a moment of profound sadness for Nigerian football. Thankfully, some people were still able to find the positives. It is an extraordinary fall from grace for a country which culturally and demographically ought to boast one of the best teams and overall player pools on the planet though, which is why I have received an extraordinary number of requests to make a video about it. And today, that's what I'm gonna do. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Nigeria, one of many countries that Donald Trump is currently threatening to invade, as we take a look at why there is nothing super about the Super Eagles at this moment in time, who it was that clipped their wings, and whether they are ever likely to fly as high as they did in the 1990s again. In the post-mortem of Nigeria's failure to qualify for a second successive World Cup, and what feels like an all-time low for the national team, there are two main topics of conversation. One is an inquest into the specific failures of this qualifying campaign over the last 2 years, and the flaws of this current Nigeria squad in terms of their staff, players and tactics, and the other, much larger discussion, regards the systemic failures not just of the national team, but of Nigerian football as a whole, the country's disgraced football federation, and the managed decline that several key figures have orchestrated over the last 3 decades, many of whom, it is alleged, while enriching themselves. I want to talk about both in this video, and of course, they are deeply intertwined. Nigeria's first game of the current international break was against Gabon in Rabat, the capital of Morocco, in the semi-finals of the CAF World Cup qualifying playoffs. There were 9 CAF qualifying groups for the 2026 World Cup, with the winners of each qualifying automatically for the tournament, and the 4 best placed runners-up going into a playoff stage, where the winner, DR Congo as it transpired, earns a spot in the Interconfederation playoffs to become potentially the 10th African team at the World Cup. Ahead of their crucial playoff semi-final against Gabon, though, Nigeria's players refused to train owing to a pay dispute with the Nigerian Football Federation. For Nigerians, this is nothing new. Even the national team's golden age during the 1990s was marred by financial trouble and unfulfilled promises. Whilst from the outside, Nigeria appeared to be a team full of joy and expression, within the team's own camp, reports that Nigeria's Football Federation lacked the funds to pay their promised bonuses and allowances blighted an otherwise outstanding campaign. This set the tone for the 3 decades that have followed, with very few, if any, moments of genuine efficiency and quiet, in which the Super Eagles were able to focus all of their efforts on football. Nigeria's refusal to train before their game against Gabon also owed to allegedly unpaid bonuses and allowances, with Nigeria captain William Troost-Ekong, who led the boycott but with unanimous support from his teammates, stating that the players weren't just making a stand for themselves and what they were owed, but also for the future of Nigerian football and the next generation of players. At one stage, it wasn't even clear if Nigeria's players would take to the field against Gabon. In the end, they did, winning 4-1 in extra time thanks to a brace by Victor Osimhen, but it was hardly ideal preparation for the country's biggest games in years. In the CAF playoff final against DR Congo, Nigeria's players looked noticeably fatigued, struggling to match the intensity and athleticism of the Congolese, just 3 days after going 120 minutes against Gabon. In the inquest into Nigeria's inability to produce an immense player pool reflective of their population, age demographics, and sheer passion for football, Nigeria has a population of over 200 million people, an average age of just 18, and football borders upon a national religion. Many observers point to political instability, economic hardship, and corruption. Nigeria has been described as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, with a 2012 report estimating that Nigeria had lost over $400 billion to corruption since gaining independence in 1960. That is 140% of the country's annual GDP. Corruption is pervasive throughout Nigerian society, ranging from the Nigerian government and politicians through to the lucrative oil and gas sectors, and low-level bribery, money laundering, and embezzlement among citizens. Nigeria endured a bloody and devastating civil war within 7 years of gaining independence, which claimed at least 1.5 million lives in only 3 years, and constant coups and coup attempts caused greater instability for more than 30 years. When Nigeria won AFCON, Olympic gold, and made consecutive appearances in the round of 16 at the World Cup, it was still a military dictatorship. Democracy, which Nigeria only transitioned to in 1999, is still a fairly recent experiment then, and not a wholly successful one. Nigeria suffers from weak institutions, elections are plagued by accusations of corruption and foul play, and the continued threat posed by separatist groups and the jihadist militant organisation Boko Haram have further fueled concerns regarding national security and stability. Reports on the scale of death and destruction caused by Boko Haram vary wildly, but there is no doubt that the group, who operate primarily in the northeast of Nigeria, have killed thousands of people, with the World Bank estimating their death toll at 20,000, plus almost $6 billion in damages back in 2016, as well as the truly horrific kidnapping of almost 300 schoolgirls in Chibok in 2014. Earlier this month, Donald Trump pledged on Truth Social that he would, quote, do things to Nigeria that Nigeria is not going to be happy about, adding that the US, quote, may very well go into that now disgraced country, guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible, horrible atrocities. End quote. Thankfully, that has really cooled the tensions. You could be forgiven, therefore, for thinking that Nigeria has bigger fish to fry than football, that the government just has more pressing concerns, and that Nigeria lacks the resources to properly fund the sport. But that is a wholly inadequate explanation. Nigeria is relatively poor and corrupt by international standards, but so too are their much smaller neighbours, like Côte d'Ivoire or Cameroon. The Ivory Coast is less than 1/7 of the size of Nigeria, and only has a marginally higher GDP per capita, yet they won the most recent AFCON, beating Nigeria in the final, and qualified comfortably for the 2026 World Cup. Meanwhile, Cameroon is even smaller still, has a lower GDP per capita than Nigeria, and is just as corrupt and even less democratic, as covered previously on this channel, having been governed by 92-year-old autocrat Paul Biya since 1982, who was re-elected for yet another term in yet another very free and fair election last month. Yet they too have qualified for the World Cup and won the Africa Cup of Nations more recently than Nigeria. They also, arguably, when one thinks of Flavien Boyomo, Carlos Baliba and Brian Mbeumo in Cameroon's case, and Evan Ndika, Ousmane Diomande and Amad Diallo's in the Ivory Coasts, not to mention the likes of Samuel Eto'o, Didier Drogba, and both Yaya and Kolo Touré before them, have more impressive talent development, certainly in relation to their populations. Heck, Nigeria were just knocked out of World Cup qualifying by DR Congo, one of the most impoverished, unstable, and conflict-stricken countries on the planet. It seems, therefore, that there is a specific sickness at the heart of Nigerian football, which goes beyond macroeconomics and national instability. It might not be as simple, in other words then, as saying Boko Haram are responsible for the Super Eagles playing so-called Haramball in World Cup qualifying. No, it is another terror group hell-bent on destruction who many consider to be primarily responsible for Nigeria's strife, namely the Nigerian Football Federation. Just to be clear, that was a joke. I am being satirical. The Nigerian Football Federation is not, officially at least, designated as a terrorist organisation, even if they are about as popular as one among many Nigerians. Practically a byword for corruption in Nigeria, the NFF's Wikipedia page, somewhat amusingly, just includes the dictionary definition of the word corruption. There is just an entire heading labelled Corruption and Development of the NFF, which begins with the sentence, quote, "Corruption is the unlawful enrichment of oneself by the use of one's workplace, whether through bribery, theft, or receipts of compensation, for the execution of what should have been one's usual task." End quote. That's not a part of some broader sentence, or in relation to an isolated or specific example of alleged corruption within the NFF. That is just a standalone statement on their wiki page, which, I found it amusing anyway. There have been multiple allegations of corruption and misappropriated funds against the NFF. There was the $8.4 million fraud accusation in 2019 relating to a misappropriated FIFA grant under the presidency of Amadou Pinnock. There was the 2013 bribery revelations, which saw the former chairman of the NFF's disciplinary committee, Lei Adepoju, banned for 10 years. And then there was Amos Aramu, the former sole administrator of the Nigeria Football Federation, who received a 3-year ban from the FIFA Ethics Committee for bribery in 2010, followed by a further 2-year ban for violating general rules of conduct, loyalty, and conflict of interest in 2017. I'm sure that it will come as a surprise to many of you that FIFA has an ethics committee. I could list more corruption scandals and allegations relating to the Nigerian Football Federation, but I fear that this video would be longer than Nigeria's World Cup exile. Guardian writer and former BBC journalist Osazu Obeyuana reported following Nigeria's defeat against the DR Congo that sources had told him that the reason why the Nigeria players boycotted training in Rabat was because they were owed just over $130,000 for their World Cup qualifying wins over Lesotho and Benin, which the Nigerian government had made available to the NFF, but which had never been filtered down to the players themselves. Mohamed Sanusi, who is the General Secretary and CEO of the NFF, denied those allegations, responding directly to Obeyuana on the website formerly known as Twitter, in which he stated, quote, "Osasu, the information you have is not true, and whoever provided it is incorrect." End quote. In 2013, during the same year that several Nigerian players and officials were banned for life, for their roles in a match-fixing scandal involving 2 matches which ended with scorelines of 79-0 and 67-0, subtle lads, and in which all 4 clubs involved were banned for 10 years, the then president of the Nigerian Senate, David Mark, described the Nigerian Football Federation as the most corrupt government agency in the country. And believe me, there is some stiff competition. That is the moral equivalent of being described as the most problematic tourist to have visited Epstein Island. They say that a fish rots from the head down, and Nigerian football is now a deeply rotten fish. In the early 2000s, Nigerian champions in Yimba became the first club to win back-to-back CAF Champions League titles, but not a single Nigerian club has reached a major continental final in the more than 2 decades since then. In the CAF 5-year coefficient rankings, Nigeria now ranks 12th, below Libya and Sudan. For the largest country in Africa, with the second largest economy as measured by GDP PPP, it is a source of immense shame and embarrassment. Nigeria doesn't have a lack of talent. The streets of Uyo, Aba and Lagos are full of immensely talented young players, and Nigeria have an outstanding record at international youth level. No country has won the FIFA Under-17 World Cup more times than Nigeria, whose 5 titles puts them 1 ahead of Brazil on 4, meanwhile no other national team has won the tournament more than twice. At the Under-20 World Cup likewise, Nigeria have only failed to qualify for 1 out of the last 10 editions of the tournament, reaching 2 finals during that time, as well as winning a record 7 Under-20 AFCONs. What this shows, some would say, is that Nigerians tend to be early developers who are physically fitter or stronger than a lot of their opponents at under-17 level, but that advantage is gradually eroded by under-20 level and almost entirely lost by the time that they reach the senior game. There isn't actually any scientific evidence to support these claims, much of which are rooted in antiquated but nonetheless persistent biological racism within the public consciousness, though it may be the case that Nigerian academies and the Nigerian Football Federation prioritise physical attributes among young players, self-selecting for those who are bigger or stronger in certain age groups, to the detriment of more tactically or technically gifted players who may then slip through the net. Such claims are primarily anecdotal, though there is some academic research which suggests that Nigerian clubs and governing bodies are predisposed towards short-termism, but what it really shows is that there is a development gap between the ages, roughly speaking, of 14 to 18, and then from 18 onwards. This is markedly similar to the issue that is faced by North Korean players, covered in my most recent video, who are especially dominant in women's football at youth level, but struggle to develop in line with their international peers from their late teens onwards, most likely owing to the country's weak infrastructure, outside of the Pyongyang International Football School, the lack of professional clubs and a competitive league system, and very rarely being tested against international class oppositions, either on match days or in training. Due to the systemic degradation of Nigerian football, from the Nigeria Premier Football League through to grassroots level, Nigeria suffers from a lot of the same problems. Nigerian football is poorly run, poorly funded, and increasingly poorly supported in something of a vicious cycle, as Nigerians increasingly turn their interest towards foreign leagues, most notably the Premier League, as opposed to their own beleaguered domestic game. Nigeria is a large country, in terms of both size and population, and one of the biggest problems, as in many large developing countries, is in terms of the actual coverage and distribution of clubs, coaches, and even relatively basic facilities, like pitches, throughout the nation as a whole. It is a recurring theme, in almost every instance, when you look at over- or underachieving footballing nations, the extent to which they have the human resources and the basic infrastructure to be able to identify and develop their most talented young players. Croatia and Portugal, for example, which are relatively small countries, are excellent at identifying talented players at an early age and funneling them into appropriate settings in order to nurture their talent, as are the likes of Japan and Brazil, to give larger and perhaps more comparable examples. Meanwhile, the likes of India, China and Pakistan, 3 of the 5 largest countries in the world, are absolutely atrocious at it, and that is reflected in the strength of their national teams. Nigeria aren't nearly as dire as those 3, but an enormous amount of talent either slips through the net entirely due to a lack of coverage and resources, meaning those players get missed, or is correctly identified but filtered into an academy setting which is light years behind many of their international peers, particularly in Europe and South America, but even in other parts of Africa, and therefore their development is stunted and their potential is wasted. The major difference between Nigeria and North Korea, and the comparison might sound amusing, but in that sense at least I think it's a reasonable one, is that Nigerians are able to leave Nigeria and play and develop overseas. Victor Osimhen, for example, was signed by Bundesliga side Wolfsburg shortly after he turned 17, owing to his impressive performances at the 2015 Under-17 World Cup, which Nigeria won, and where he won the tournament's Golden Boot. The likes of John Obi Mikel, Moses Simon, and indeed pretty much every major Super Eagles star who was born in Nigeria was snapped up by a European club in their teens, most of them after impressing at some kind of international youth tournament or competition. The problem here, however, is twofold. One, not having a strong, competitive, and well-resourced league system of your own, and not being able to properly develop and nurture your own players to maturity is an inherent problem, because it forces young boys and girls to uproot their whole lives, and separates them from friends, families, and communities, which presents a whole range of challenges, which can negatively impact upon a player's development both on, but especially off the pitch. And two, the issue of corruption and unscrupulousness rears its ugly head once again, as Nigerian football is rife with agents and intermediaries who are primarily out for themselves and to make a quick buck, acting on behalf of young players whose best interest they don't have at heart. I am painting in broad strokes, of course. There will be plenty of perfectly capable, professional, and honourable intermediaries in Nigerian football, as well as many who aren't, as is the case everywhere in the world, but the propensity, and often desperation of young Nigerian players to earn contracts overseas lends itself to predatory representation, which can stunt their development just as much as stagnating in an inadequate domestic environment. I could list individual examples, but again, we would be here for hours. The most telling statistic is that of the Nigeria squads, which won back-to-back Under-17 World Cups in 2013 and 2015, all of whom are now aged between 25 and 30, just two of them, Victor Osimhen and Samuel Chukwueze, both from their 2015 squad, were in Nigeria's most recent World Cup squad for their all-important World Cup playoff qualifiers against Gabon and DR Congo. This was what looked to be, and should have been, a generational group of Nigerian players, possibly even a second golden generation following in the footsteps of the Super Eagles stars of the 1990s, but instead, not only did almost nothing, with the very notable exception of Osimhen, come of it, they spurred Nigeria's worst team of the modern era. It is a recurring theme in this video, but that is a fact which shames those involved with Nigerian football and their incompetence, malfeasance, or combination of the two. In terms of the specifics of this failed World Cup qualifying campaign, Nigeria have never had a settled squad or management. In less than 4 years, the team has had 6 different managers. It all started with the controversial sacking of German boss Gernot Röhr, who was Nigeria's last long-term incumbent. Appointed in 2016, Röhr's Nigeria qualified for the 2018 World Cup and finished third at AFCON 2019 before he was set the target of winning AFCON 2021 and qualifying for the 2022 World Cup. Nigeria went unbeaten in AFCON qualifying and won 4, lost 1 and drew 1 of their first 6 2022 World Cup qualifiers, which was enough to see Röhr lose his job. Röhr's sacking divided opinion among Nigeria fans, and it looked more than a little foolish following failure to qualify for the World Cup and a round of 16 exit at AFCON. It looked like an even stranger decision when the NFF were unable to pay Röhr the compensation that he was owed, despite being mandated to do so by FIFA, with the organisation attributing the delay to their precarious financial predicament. Over 6 months after he was sacked, FIFA ended up paying Röhr the remainder of what he was owed, reportedly after Nigeria's Football Federation agreed for his compensation to be paid out of a deducted percentage of their income from FIFA's development fund. It's a good thing that there are no issues with grassroots football or player development in Nigeria, otherwise that would look really bad for them. Röhr was eventually replaced by Portuguese manager José Peseiro, 5 months after he had verbally agreed to take the job, who had most recently managed Venezuela, but he too departed, following defeat in the final of AFCON 2023. He was replaced by Nigeria legend Finidi George, who had been part of Peseiro's backroom staff, in another appointment that split opinion among Super Eagles supporters. George's tenure was as short as it was disastrous, consisting only of a draw at home against South Africa and a defeat away to Benin, which were hugely damaging to the team's World Cup qualification prospects. To make matters worse still, Benin, Nigeria's much smaller neighbours, beat them while being managed by ex-Super Eagles boss Gernot Röhr. Finidi George was also reported to have fallen out with Nigeria's star man, Victor Osimhen, after accusing him of faking an injury to miss an international break, but it wasn't even poor results or squad unrest that ultimately led to his departure. While driving in his car, George heard that the NFF were bringing in a technical director who he would report to. Enraged at not having been consulted about the move first, George pulled over and then resigned. That is when current Nigeria boss Eric Chell, an Ivorian-born former Mali international, was appointed, and though Nigeria's results picked up following his arrival, marginally, their performances remained uninspiring. Nigeria came close to progressing to the Intercontinental playoffs. In the end, it came down to the lottery of penalties, but in reality, they didn't deserve it. Victor Osimhen was withdrawn at halftime due to a hamstring injury, with reports of a halftime bust-up being the real reason, quickly dismissed by the Nigeria camp, and he was shortly followed by Samuel Chukwueze. Chukwueze, who plays alongside fellow Super Eagle Alex Iwobi at Fulham, on loan from AC Milan, didn't impress, not just in this game but throughout most of qualifying, and actually through most of his Nigeria career in all truth, though he's far from being alone on that front. But without both him and Osimhen, Nigeria were reduced to playing long ball football against ostensibly inferior opposition. DR Congo never looked inferior though, winning first balls, hunting in packs, and always looking the more likely to break the deadlock. Even during the shootout, 3 of Nigeria's 6 penalty takers were defenders, 2 of them centre-backs, including Semi Ajayi, who, and I say this with affection as a Hull City fan, has never been known for his ball-playing capabilities. Nigeria's 2 centre-backs, Ajayi and Calvin Bassey, the latter of whom was undoubtedly Nigeria's man of the match throughout the 90 minutes, both failed to convert. William Troost-Ekong, meanwhile, Nigeria's captain and designated penalty taker, aside from Osimhen, who converted both of his penalties and won the Player of the Tournament award at AFCON 2023, was never introduced from the bench. DR Congo, by contrast, changed their goalkeeper right before the shootout, bringing on 26-year-old Timothy Fayulu for what was only his second cap for the national team, but he was excellent. It felt as though, from the first minute through to the last, even to the extent of substitutions before the shootout, and those who volunteered to take them, DR Congo were the more proactive team, and Nigeria were almost resigned to their fate. One thing that was notably absent from Nigeria's qualifying campaign, and for a number of years in truth, was any sense of identity or coherent system and style of play. When you think of the likes of Finidi George, Sunday Oliseh, JJ Okocha and Daniel Amakachi all tearing down the pitch in the 90s, or Ahmed Musa, Victor Moses, Peter Odemwingie and Emmanuel Emenike in the early to mid-2010s, all 4 of whom started for Nigeria in the 2014 World Cup round of 32 against France, by the way. These were Nigeria teams with a clear understanding of what they were good at and how they could hurt teams, and who worked in tangent to carry out that task. This Nigeria team, by contrast, lacks any kind of rhythm or cohesion. Their forward line, on paper, is probably bettered on the continent only by Senegal's, but in reality, it is no exaggeration to say that without Osimhen, Nigeria look clueless. That's a big problem, not least since Osimhen was sidelined earlier in qualifying, in that costly draw and defeat under Finidi George, and then ruled out again at half-time against DR Congo. Had Osimhen been available throughout the entire campaign, Nigeria most likely would have qualified for the World Cup, but they ought not be so dependent on one individual. There has been audible backlash within some quarters against Nigerian players from the Diaspora who perhaps didn't choose to represent Nigeria from the very beginning of their careers. Nigeria legend John Obi Mikel, among others, has voiced frustration at those who he says view Nigeria, or any other African national team, as their second or third choice if they're unable to represent their typically European nations of birth, stating that he wants the national team to be represented only by people to whom Nigeria is their priority. What is being expressed there, in truth, is a frustration regarding either a real or a perceived lack of commitment and motivation on the part of some players, which isn't actually restricted to those born overseas. Nigerian natives like Wilfred Ndidi, Samuel Chukwueze and Moses Simon have all come in for intense criticism at times, alongside the likes of Ademola Lookman or Semi Ajayi, both of whom were born in Europe, and both of them in London to be specific. It is interesting to contrast this sense of malcontent and disharmony with other African national teams who have improved greatly in recent years, which is part of the reason why Nigeria have struggled, thanks in no small part to their own influx of diaspora players. Some of the DR Congo star men, for example, like French-born Arthur Masuaku and Cedric Bakambu, Belgian-born Noah Sadiki, and Croydon native Aaron Wan-Bissaka, have all been successfully integrated into Sébastien Desabre, himself a Frenchman squad. Meanwhile, Cape Verde just qualified for their first ever World Cup with several diaspora players, most of them born in the Netherlands, playing a starring role, and, albeit outside of Africa, Curaçao just qualified for their first ever World Cup with a team which contained no players who were born in Curaçao. Discord within the Nigeria dressing room is nothing new. Sunday Oliseh, one of the stars of Nigeria's golden generation, has previously described how the Nigeria squads that he was a part of included several very different characters who weren't necessarily best friends off the pitch, but when they stepped on the team bus or crossed the white line, they put those differences aside and focused fully on the team. Oliseh described it as being almost like national service. This current Nigeria squad appears to suffer from a lot of the same internal ruptures, but without the willingness or ability to put those differences to one side for the good of the national team. There is also a level of incongruence or tension between Nigeria's almost exclusively multi-millionaire players now, at least outfield, most of whom play in major European top flights, and the travel facilities and general luxuries that they are accustomed to, versus those provided by the cash-strapped, or at least claiming to be cash-strapped, Nigeria Football Federation. While stationed in Morocco's capital of Rabat over the most recent international break, Alex Iwobi shared a video on social media mocking the accommodation that Nigeria players were staying in. Most members of the Nigeria squad, Iwobi included, would probably be able to buy the building that was housing them with a week's wages. Some people have asked why Nigeria's players, or even just a handful of the highest paid members of the squad, don't pay to put themselves and their teammates up in safer and more comfortable surroundings, and Nigeria players have contributed towards their own expenses, and their teams in the past. John Obi Mikel, speaking on the Peter Crouch podcast, recently told of how, before the 2016 Olympics in Brazil, Nigeria were left stranded at their hotel in the United States because the funds for their flights had been held up by the Football Federation. Mikel claims that, consequently, he paid for the Nigeria squad's flights to Rio out of his own pocket, where the Super Eagles would go on to win Olympic bronze, and for which he has never been reimbursed. Samson Siase, Nigeria's manager at the time, who was handed a lifetime ban by FIFA for match fixing in 2019, which was later reduced to 5 years by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, has denied the claim that Mikel paid for the team's flights, although he conceded that the former Chelsea midfielder did pay for some of the team's other expenses. Whatever the truth of those claims and counterclaims, the fundamental point, of course, is that while some Nigeria players may be able to fund their team's expenses, Nigeria is a country of 237 million people, not some tiny Pacific island, which should be able to provide a basic level of comfort and professionalism for their players. That might not be the same level of comfort that Calvin Bassey has afforded at Fulham or Victor Osimhen at Galatasaray, but enough to make their players feel as though they are valued and respected, and that they are acting on behalf of a serious operation. Thank God that Roy Keane wasn't Nigerian. That's all I'll say. There is also a degree to which the accommodation that Alex Iwobi shared the Nigeria team staying in Rabat, for example, is most likely a security and safety concern for Nigeria's players. These are, mostly, very wealthy young men who are often targeted for thefts, burglaries, and even, in admittedly and thankfully much rarer instances, hostage-taking, and providing them with a basic level of insulation against those threats ought to be a minimum requirement, one would have thought. But then again, there are lots of things that, under normal circumstances, one might have thought about the Nigeria Football Federation, but Nigerian football doesn't operate under anything like normal circumstances. In the same interview with the Peter Crouch podcast, John Obi Mikel, or Mikel John Obi as he is better known in Nigeria, because that's his name, expressed a desire to become part of the national team setup within the Nigeria Football Federation, and he has since reiterated that, quote, "The corruption has to be rooted out of the game if we want to go forward." End quote. This video has been quite negative. It would be odd if it wasn't, to be honest, wouldn't it? Given the subject matter and the current state of Nigerian football. But it is always worth shining a light on a mostly positive sliver of hope, which is the Nigeria women's team. That is largely in spite of, as opposed to thanks to the NFF, most experts on Nigerian football will tell you, but Nigeria's women's team have qualified for literally every single Women's World Cup since the inaugural tournament was held in China in 1991, and they reached the round of 16 at each of the last two editions in France and Australia and New Zealand. At the last World Cup in 2023, I honestly thought Nigeria were pretty unfortunate not to win against eventual finalists and two-time European champions England, who went on to beat them on penalties. In a continent where women's football is chronically underfunded, neglected, and in some cases and communities actively discouraged, the Super Falcons have become absolute powerhouses, winning 12 out of a possible 15 women's AFCONs since the tournament's inception in 1991. Nonetheless, when one thinks of the funding and opportunity gap between the young Nigerian women and girls and the young English women and girls, the fact that they were able to go toe-to-toe with England at a World Cup, taking that game to penalties, having drawn with Canada and Ireland, and beat Australia during the group stage, is nothing short of remarkable. And it wouldn't take much, on that basis, to turn Nigeria into one of the dominant forces, alongside the likes of England, Spain, and the United States, within the women's game. For the men's team, they have an instant shot at redemption at the 2025 Africa Cup of Nations, which starts in just a month's time. Despite the unmitigated disaster of failing to qualify for the upcoming World Cup, expectations, as always, will be immense. Only intensified, if anything, by the demand for a reaction and for the team to make a statement. AFCON has a thrilling and unusual habit of providing unlikely storylines, and results at AFCON and in World Cup qualifying, as in the case of Ghana and Nigeria, quite often don't align as one might imagine. When the dust settles on this tournament, though, there has to be a reckoning. But then again, we have been here before. Nigerian football has been plagued by the same administrative, financial, and developmental problems for decades. Everyone in Nigeria knows the issues and what needs to happen for the good of the game, except, it would seem, for the people who are in charge of making those decisions. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, or found it remotely interesting or informative. I sincerely hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, in case you were unaware, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms, typically via the username at HITC Sevens should you wish to do so, and you can also support me additionally now, and that is to say, financially, if you're a real fan of the channel and want to become more engaged by becoming a channel member, either by heading over to the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, where you can become a channel member, or by heading to buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsama, where you can do the exact same thing, become a channel member that is, but Google won't take 30% of it. So yeah, it's an option. I hope to see you all very shortly. Until then, take care out there. I love you all very much. Cheers.